This is the first of a four-part lecture series on the Battle of Guadalcanal. This first lecture will be about the battles of Tulagi and Gavutu and Tanambogo that preceded the Battle of Guadalcanal by 1 hour on August 7, 1942. The next two lectures will be about the land battles on Guadalcanal. The final lecture of this series will be about the naval battles around Guadalcanal. But before I delve into the Battle of Tulagi, I would like to briefly relate how Guadalcanal got its name. How did Guadalcanal get its name? A Spanish expedition from Peru in 1568 under the command of Alvaro de Mendana was the first European to see the island. Mendana's subordinate, Pedro de Ortega Valencia, named the island after his hometown, Guadalcanal, in Andalusia, Spain. The name comes from the Arabic Wadi al-Ganat, which means Valley of Stalls or River of Stalls, referring to the refreshment stalls which were set up there during the Muslim rule in Andalusia. Here's where Guadalcanal, Spain is located. Here I am standing on the road outside Guadalcanal in 2018. Here is a nice photo I took of the little village of Guadalcanal in the Andalusian hills of Spain. This is a map of the theater of operation, including the Western Pacific and the Southwest Pacific. This is the area where the Solomon Islands are located. This is a map of the Solomon Islands with Guadalcanal toward the southeastern end of the archipelago. This is a map of Guadalcanal and the Florida Islands with Iron Bottom Sound in between. Savo Island is to the northwest of the sound. As far as island battles in the Pacific are concerned, Guadalcanal is one of the larger ones. It is about 80 miles long and 34 miles wide. But only a very small part of the island was of any military importance. Except for the battles fought mostly in January 1943 when the Japanese were ejected from the island, all of the fighting took place at the marine perimeter around the Lunga Point, so named for the river that runs through it. The other battle took place across Iron Bottom Sound on a little island called Tulagi. These two islands are about 25 miles apart. After the Japanese achieved their initial strategic pre-war objectives, they set out to expand their perimeter into the South Pacific with the goal of severing the lines of communication between America and Australia. This is what led to the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Japanese strategic goal in the Battle of the Coral Sea was to occupy Port Moresby on the Papuan Peninsula and Tulagi in the Solomon Islands. Control of these strategically important positions were the first steps to continuing their advance into the South Pacific. From airfields on the Papuan Peninsula and the Southern Solomons, the Japanese threatened Australia and could sever the lines of communication to Australia from America. The strategic goal here was to deny Australia to the Allies so that it could not be used to launch a counteroffensive against the Japanese perimeter. Operation Watchtower was the code name for the first American offensive in World War II. The code name for Guadalcanal was Cactus, and the code name for Tulagi was Ringbolt. Tulagi was invaded about an hour before the invasion of Guadalcanal. The invasion of Tulagi also included the invasion of Gavutu and Tanambogo. Both began at 8 o'clock after the usual pre-invasion shore bombardment. To each side of this photo of Tulagi is the shoulder patch of the 1st Raider Battalion. You can see the Southern Cross depicted here, indicating the association of the Raiders with Australia. Here is a comparison of the Raider patch with the shoulder patch for the 1st Marine Division. They are similar in that they both have the Southern Cross. The 1st Marine Division patch was designed by Colonel Twining, whom we will meet later. Here is the Raider patch on the shoulder of General James Amos, 35th Commandant of the Marine Corps. I had the honor to meet General Amos at the American Memorial on Guadalcanal during the 70th anniversary ceremony. Tulagi was the capital of the British Solomon Island Protectorate from 1897 to 1942. Charles Woodford was its first resident commissioner. This is where his home was located on a hill on Tulagi. The photo in the inset is of the concrete piles that supported the house and all that is left of the commissioner's home today. Tulagi's deep harbor made it ideal as an anchorage. It was so good that after a visit in 1926, Lord Jellicoe, the first Sea Lord of the Royal Navy, recommended to the British government that Tulagi and Gavutu area be developed as a major base for the British Navy. For financial reasons, the British government turned down the recommendation. Tulagi became the headquarters of the British administration of the Solomon Islands. One of two companies with an office in the Solomons was the Burns Phillips Shipping Company, which had a near monopoly on passenger service and shipping in the Solomons and Melanesia until the outbreak of the war. Their main office was located on the island of Macambo, just north of Tulagi. The major industry in the Solomon Islands was the production of copper from coconuts. The Lever Brothers Company was the leading manufacturer of copper in the Pacific and had its Solomon headquarters at Gavutu, Tanimbogo. Sunlight soap was its main product. In 1938, Martin Clemens, born in Aberdeen, Scotland, joined the colonial service and was sent to the British Solomon Islands via Sydney, Australia. He served for 3 years as a cadet on Malaita and became district officer in 1941. With the coming of war, he volunteered for military service in the British Solomon Island Protectorate Defense Force and was commissioned a captain. Here is the ticket he used to sail from Sydney to Tulagi aboard the Burns Phillips ship Malaita, which he purchased for £17 12 shillings. You can also see his signature here. We will learn more about Martin Clemens later and his considerable contribution to the war on Guadalcanal, especially the Battle of the Tenarue. With the threat of war growing throughout the year in 1941, Martin Clemens was put in command of this platoon of Solomon Islanders called the British Solomon Island Protectorate Defense Force. Their only weapons were .303 Enfield rifles. With the looming war with Japan, in 1940, the Royal Australian Air Force established a small seaplane base at Tanimbogo. PBY Catalina flying boats were to fly reconnaissance missions from here. Lever Brothers were commissioned to build a causeway connecting the two islands. This photo was taken in 1940. Construction of the causeway connecting the two islands has just begun. On May 12, 1941, the first Catalina arrived at the new base. It was manned by 30 Royal Australian Air Force maintenance and service personnel looking after the 4 aircraft. It was defended by 16 men from the Australian No. 1 Independent Commandos. This photo, taken in April 1942, shows the completed work on the Royal Australian Air Force base and its layout just 2 weeks before the Japanese landed on May 3rd. Note the completed causeway. This is the PBY Catalina flying boat, the Allied equivalent of the Japanese Kawanishi Mavis reconnaissance plane. It had a range of 2,500 miles, or 4,100 kilometers. It was a very versatile and reliable plane throughout the war. The Japanese began bombing Tulagi and the Royal Australian Air Force at Gavutu, Tanimbogo on January 22, 1942. Eventually, the civilian population was evacuated from Tulagi and the British administration moved to the Solomon island of Malaita in the southern Solomons. By February, Tulagi had been abandoned, but the Australians on Gavutu would go over to Tulagi to hang laundry to give the Japanese bombers the impression that people were still there. The ruse apparently worked, and the Japanese kept bombing Tulagi, thereby diverting some bombs from the Royal Australian Air Force base at Gavutu. Because of the regular Japanese attacks, the 4 Catalinas based at Gavutu spent as little time as possible at the base. They were moved to other bays in the islands just before the Japanese bombers arrived on their regular schedule. It became obvious that the base at Gavutu Tanimbogo would be impossible to defend with the tiny force of Australians. Plans were made to evacuate the base before the Japanese arrived. On May 1, 1942, 2 of the Gavutu Catalina reconnaissance planes saw the approaching Japanese occupation fleet. On May 2nd, there were constant air attacks from Japanese planes. As Japanese warships approached, the garrison was ordered to withdraw. The base radio informed their intentions to leave by broadcasting the coded message, "Steak and eggs." This is a photo of the Royal Australian Air Force personnel who evacuated Gavutu, who returned to Sydney to continue their part of the war. The garrison departed on the 80-ton boat the Ballast. This is a map drawn by a Royal Australian Air Force navigator, Bob Byrne, to show the captain of the Ballast how to get to Villa in the New Hebrides. They departed Gavutu by 2300 hours on May 2, 1942, with minutes to spare before the Japanese landed on Tulagi 2 hours later, on May 3rd. The Japanese landed on RXB, their code name for Tulagi, unopposed. They also landed at Gavutu on the Lever Brothers Wharf and immediately set about to establish a flying boat base. These are the Japanese officers and petty officers of the 3rd Curie Special Naval Landing Force that seized Tulagi on May 3, 1942, and who were killed almost to a man in the Allied attacks on August 7th and 8th. Lieutenant Junior Grade Kakichi Yoshimoto is sitting in the center of row 1. He was due to retire after this last assignment. He was scheduled to leave Tulagi on August 8th. He did not make it. The Marines landed the day before. This is a Google Earth view of Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanimbogo. Tulagi is approximately 3.5 miles long and about a half-mile wide. They are part of the Florida Islands. Haleta and Halevo are villages that flank the target islands. Here is a closer satellite view of Tulagi and the location of the invasion beach named Blue Beach. The Japanese located their main defenses in and around Hill 281, which they called Bird Hill. The Japanese did not have long to wait for an American response to their occupation of Tulagi. The next day, May 4th, the USS Yorktown, under the command of Admiral Jack Fletcher, was south of Guadalcanal, about to begin the Battle of the Coral Sea. They had been alerted to the presence of the Japanese at Tulagi. Fletcher decided to strike. Planes from the Yorktown attacked, inflicting significant damage to Japanese shipping, including sinking the destroyer Kikutsuki. This is the Imperial Japanese destroyer Kikutsuki before the war. Here is the Kikutsuki after it was sunk. After the Marines took Tulagi, it was later raised from the bottom and refloated. Here is what the Kikutsuki looks like today. This is the route taken by Task Force 62, the amphibious force, and Task Force 61, the carrier covering force, from Fiji to the Watchtower area. This is a schematic of the formation of Task Force 62 with a ringed defense in depth. The most important assets, the transports, are nested in the center for protection. Located in the first ring of defense are the cruisers. 4 of these cruisers will be sunk and the 5th heavily damaged in the Battle of Savo Island in just 3 days. The outer ring of defense is composed of destroyers to protect the transports from both an aerial attack and from submarines. This was the principal mission of the destroyers. This is one of the APA attack transports used to bring the Marines to Guadalcanal and Tulagi. APA stands for Auxiliary Personnel Attack. Here are 2 of the carriers of Task Force 61, Enterprise and Saratoga. These were the only 2 carriers that started the war and were still afloat at the end of the war. This is the 3rd carrier of Task Force 61, USS Wasp. Task Force 61 was composed of 3 separate task forces, Task Force 11, 16, and 18. Task Force 11 was centered on Saratoga, the flagship of the Task Force 61's commander, Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher. Task Force 16 was centered on Enterprise. Task Force 18 was centered on WASP. This is an approximation of the sailing configuration of Task Force 61 with individual Task Force 11, 16, and 18 and Saratoga in the van. This is the approach route of Task Force 62, the transports bearing the Marines of the 1st Division and their supplies. Task Force 62 approached from the south early in the morning of August 7, 1942. Just west of Savo Island, it split into two groups. Yoke Group sailed with the Tulagi force toward Blue Beach, while the X-Ray Group sailed with the 1st Marine Division to Red Beach on Guadalcanal. At the same time, Task Force 61, which included the 3 aircraft carriers that were to provide air cover during the initial landings, sailed in from the west and launched Wildcat fighters and SBD dive bombers to soften up the landing beaches and to knock out the Japanese float planes and flying boats. Once the amphibious force reached the west side of Savo Island, it split in two. The Tulagi force, codenamed Yoke, sailed to just off Blue Beach. X-Ray force sailed to just off of Red Beach on Guadalcanal. The Japanese established a Kawanishi flying boat base with long-range 4-engine reconnaissance planes at Gavutu and Tanimbogo and Macambo. These boats were named Mavis by the Americans. Here is a photo and a drawing of the Kawanishi flying boats. As you can see, it is a large plane. These are float planes based at Halevo and were the initial targets of the fighters and dive bombers from Task Force 61 on the morning of August 7, 1942. The roof is essentially a floating version of the Japanese Zero. Here is a schematic of the roof. This is a photograph and a schematic of the 4F-4 Wildcat used by the Marine Corps and the United States Navy. It is sporting the roundel used until the middle of 1942, when it was changed because it looked too much like the red meatball of the Japanese planes. This is a schematic of a Douglas SBD dive bomber. Notice the tail hook indicative of a carrier-based plane. This is a photograph of a later SBD over Wake Atoll. Notice the tail hook and a bomb slung beneath the plane. It usually carried one 500 or 1,000-pound bomb. This is a photo of a carrier-based SBD. They usually flew in pairs, as in this photo. Notice the new roundel without the red ball in the middle of the white star. This version was adopted in mid-1942. This is a map indicating the locations of the Kawanishi flying boats and roof float planes at Macambo, Gavutu Tanimbogo, and Halevo. They were the initial targets of the pre-invasion bombing and strafing attacks by the Wildcats and SBDs. Planes from WASP, VF-71, strafed 3 Kawanishis at Macambo and then flew onto Halevo and destroyed all 6 of the roofs. A second flight strafed 4 Kawanishis at Gavutu Tanimbogo. All of the Japanese planes were destroyed. All planes of VF-71 returned safely to WASP. Here is a reenactment of the strafing run of the Wildcats on the Kawanishis at Gavutu Tanimbogo. In addition to the Kawanishis, the seaplane ramp was also bombed. Also, this map indicates that the Japanese commanded the high ground on both islands. They had the tactical advantage, and because of the pre-invasion strafing, they had been alerted. Surprise was gone. Here's an after-action photograph of a fire and smoke plume from Tanimbogo. The wing of the plane is from an SBD. Notice the air spoilers of the wing that slowed the plane during its dive on a target. Prior to the Marine Raider landings on Blue Beach, the flanks had to be secured. The job for this was given to the 1st Battalion 2nd Marines of the 2nd Marine Division. B Company of the 2nd Marines was given the task of securing the Marine left flank. If there were any Japanese at Haleda, they could bring inflating fire from their flanking position on the Marines' main landings on Blue Beach. The landing at Helena took place at 7:40 a.m., 20 minutes before the first raiders landed at Blue Beach. The Marines landed unopposed from these landing craft and found no Japanese. The left flank was secure. They were the first ashore in the Battle of Guadalcanal. They were guided ashore by Australian pilot C.E. Spencer. To protect the right flank, the rest of the 1st Battalion of the 2nd Marines made an unopposed landing on the Halevo Peninsula, where they also encountered no Japanese. Both flanks were secure. The main landings could take place at Blue Beach. This is a photo of the 1st Raider Battalion going ashore at Blue Beach. This is an aerial photo indicating the movement of the companies of the 1st Raider Battalion moving east across Tulagi toward Hill 281, where the Japanese were dug in. Gavutu and Tanimbogo are in the background.
This map shows the movement of the Marines toward Hill 281. But before we get to this, I want to tell you about a soon-to-be famous lieutenant who lived here for a short while. Notice the pier at the village of Sasapi. This is where Lieutenant John Kennedy lived when he arrived in the Solomons in April 1943. He was assigned to the PT-109 on April 25, 1943. This is the entry from the PT-109's deck log indicating the change of command to Lieutenant Kennedy. The Japanese concentrated their defenses around Hill 281. At 0800, the 1st Raider Battalion landed at Blue Beach, followed in column form by the 2nd Battalion 5th Marines detached from the 1st Marine Division. The 2nd Battalion 5th Marines moved off to the left but encountered no Japanese. The 4 companies of the 1st Raider Battalion moved to the right across the island but also encountered no Japanese. There was a brief skirmish and Raider casualties around the Chinese quarter on the north side of Tulagi and around Hill 208 on the south side. The Raiders pressed on until they faced the main Japanese defenses around Hill 281. As evening approached and the Japanese resistance stiffened, the Raiders established a defensive line for the evening of the 7th and 8th of August. That night, various Japanese counterattacks caused some Marine casualties while suffering far more losses themselves. The next day, August 8th, the Raiders resumed their attack against the Japanese dug in and around Hill 281. The Japanese were hopelessly and overwhelmingly outnumbered, but fought to the death. Nearly all of the Japanese were killed. Only 3 were left alive to be taken prisoner. The Marines suffered 45 KIA.
Here is a photo of the cricket pitch where the battle was fought during the night of August 7th and 8th when the Japanese counterattacked. This is an aerial photograph of Gavutu and Tanimbogo with the connecting causeway connecting the 2 islands. The Kawanishis were located on the east side of the islands. Also note the seaplane ramp.
At noon, 3 companies of the 1st Parachute Battalion, A, B, and C, landed on the Lever Brothers Wharf and quickly moved inland. The Japanese were dug in on Hill 148 on Gavutu and Hill 121 on Tanimbogo, looking down on the Marines as they came ashore. They opened fire with machine guns from both hills. The parachutists suffered several casualties, but eventually overran the island. At 1825, B Company attacked Tanimbogo, but the assault bogged down. By nightfall, both sides settled in and awaited daylight. The next day at 1620, I Company, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, was added to the battle with 2 tanks. Naval gunfire was added to shell the hills and caves on Tanimbogo. The Japanese ran from their caves on Tanimbogo, exposing themselves to U.S. fire. Using gasoline-soaked rags and crowbars, they destroyed 1 tank, but took many casualties. K Company attacked from Gavutu across the causeway, and by 2100 the islands were declared secure. This is a World War II photo of the causeway connecting Gavutu and Tanimbogo. Here is a photo of the Marines running across the causeway from Gavutu to Tanimbogo. Here is a nice photo of Gavutu and Tanimbogo today. This is what Tanimbogo looked like after the battle. B Company of the 2nd Marines landed between the two piers. The Japanese flags have been replaced with the American flag. After the Japanese established their bases at Tulagi and Gavutu, they started looking for a place to construct an airstrip to accommodate fighters and bombers. The Florida Islands were unsuitable for this kind of airstrip. They started looking on Guadalcanal. This is a Japanese photo of the Lunga Plain on Guadalcanal in early July 1942. After the Japanese established their seaplane bases at Gavutu and Tanimbogo, they began looking for a site for a land-based airstrip. They determined that the Lunga Plain on Guadalcanal offered an ideal location. After taking this photo, they made a reconnaissance of Guadalcanal and decided to build the airstrip here. Subsequent American radio intercepts of Japanese messages indicated that the Japanese were building the airstrip. This fact was confirmed by the Guadalcanal coast watcher, Martin Clemens. Coast watchers observed Japanese visiting the Lunga area. Captain Shigetoshi Miyazaki, commander of the Yokohama Air Group, had been there several times in May and June, looking for ground suitable for an airstrip. He recommended that the airfield be placed on the grassy plain at Lunga. Captain Miyazaki gets the credit for the airfield being where it is. This photo also shows the Lever Brothers coconut plantation reaching inland up toward a grassy plain and the Lunga River. The grassy plain in the middle of the photo was identified by the Japanese as being suitable for an airstrip. The Japanese letters at the bottom of the photo spell out the Japanese word for Guadalcanal. This is the approximate future site of the Japanese airstrip. On July 7, 1942, 3,000 Japanese and Koreans of the 11th and 13th construction units under the command of Captain Kanei Monzen began clearing the coconut trees and the grass to build the airstrip. Security was provided by 264 men from the 81st and 84th Guard units. These are the grassy hills that came to be known as Bloody Ridge, the site of the September action, the second attempt by the Japanese to retake Henderson Field. The Marines numbered the hills while the Japanese gave them animal names. To the Japanese, the hills that comprise Bloody Ridge look like a centipede, so they called it Muckadee. As you can see, it is only a few hundred yards from the northern end of Bloody Ridge to the airstrip. If the Japanese had broken through the Marine lines in September, they would have taken the airfield and the Battle of Guadalcanal would have been over, and there would have been a lot of dead Marines and many POWs. That's why I believe the Battle of Bloody Ridge was one of the key battles of the war. This is the Lunga River. Its serpentine course has changed over the years as it winds its way down to Iron Bottom Sound. In the wake of the stunning victory at Midway in June 1942, American war planners were eager to exploit the victory and to take the strategic initiative, which up until now was entirely Japanese. General MacArthur ambitiously reported to General Marshall that if he were given the 1st Marine Division and 2 carriers, he could take Rabaul, the huge Japanese naval and air base on New Britain, and hurl the Japanese back 700 miles. Admiral King, not a fan of MacArthur to begin with, was not about to turn over 2 of his precious carriers to the Army, least of all to MacArthur. The two were frequently at odds over strategy in the Pacific. Besides, the reef-studded Solomons flanked with Japanese air bases were not good for carrier operations. Also, King and the Navy thought a more gradual approach to Rabaul was more prudent than a quick lunge by the Army. In the background to this discussion within the Joint Chiefs of Staff was the larger question of who would command the war in the Pacific, Nimitz and the Navy, or MacArthur and the Army. In the Pacific Theater, attempts to establish a unified command for the entire theater, as used in the European theater under General Eisenhower, proved impossible. Inter-service rivalry precluded the subordination of either of the two major commanders in the theater, General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz. During the final campaigns in the Pacific, therefore, these two officers held separate commands, General MacArthur in command of the Southwest Pacific Theater, and Admiral Nimitz in command of the Pacific Ocean Theater. Their commands were more or less equal in terms of resource allocation and priority. The United States in World War II had the economic power to afford dual command structures in the Pacific. It also served a military need. With two routes of advance to Japan, the Japanese were always guessing where the next blow would fall. Eventually, the Pacific Theater was divided into two main theaters of operation. Admiral Nimitz commanded the Pacific Ocean areas, further subdivided into the North, Central, and South Pacific areas. Nimitz himself commanded the North and Central Pacific areas, and Admiral Robert Gormley commanded the South Pacific area, later replaced by Admiral William Halsey. General MacArthur commanded the Southwest Pacific Theater. Here is a photo taken in 1944 of the two theater commanders, General MacArthur on the left and Admiral Nimitz on the right. The two commanders only met twice during the war, once in Australia and once in Hawaii. The two theater commanders held equal ranks, the 5 stars of General of the Army for MacArthur and 5 stars of Fleet Admiral for Nimitz. On July 2, 1942, the Joint Chiefs of Staff issued its directive for the reduction of Rabaul, known as Operation Cartwheel, that divided the mission of reducing Rabaul into 3 separate tasks. Task 1 was assigned to Admiral Nimitz and the South Pacific area under the command of Admiral Gormley and later Admiral Halsey. Tasks 2 and 3 were assigned to General MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific Theater. Originally, Task 1 called for the seizure and occupation of the Santa Cruz Islands, Tulagi, and adjacent positions. This was before the Allies were aware of the Japanese intentions to build an airstrip on Guadalcanal. The Japanese had occupied Tulagi since May. Later, the Santa Cruz Islands were scrapped and replaced with Guadalcanal. In July 1942, Colonel Merrill Twining, here as a lieutenant general, flew a mission in a B-17 from Australia to reconnoiter the proposed landing beaches on Tulagi and Guadalcanal. He determined that the landing beaches on Tulagi had a reef just offshore that precluded a landing by anything but light infantry. As the plane headed back south, it flew over the proposed landing beaches at Guadalcanal and found them to be perfect for an amphibious landing. There were no reefs off Red Beach. It was perfect for offloading men and supplies. As they continued across Guadalcanal, he could easily make out the unmistakable evidence of a nearly completed airfield. He was the first Marine to see Guadalcanal when he took this photo. Here is the exit from what would become known as Bloody Ridge, leading directly to the airfield. We will continue the Battle of Guadalcanal in the next lecture.